Happy original book release day. This is the original date where everybody was going to have their books. Now it's a few weeks later, but I still want to celebrate the occasion of the original release date. So I wanted to give you guys a full-length tutorial that is in kind of a similar vein to things that are in the book, but it's something that didn't quite make the cut. I had all sorts of ideas and I would discuss them with my editor, and the subject of this was a bird that my editor said was too scary. So if you're watching this, boo. This is a belted kingfisher. They are so cool. They actually live near where I live, and they're really fun to watch, and they're worth a Google if you like to find out fun bird facts. I highly recommend doing a bit of research. So down below in the description, you're going to be able to find a link to the PDF download for this bird. You can just print it out if you have an inkjet printer. Don't print it out on watercolor paper and then try to paint on it. It's going to get all blurry. If you've got a laser jet like me, you can just print it right onto paper. I've printed this onto Stonehenge paper so I can paint directly on top of it. But most people don't have a laser jet printer. So what do you do once you have this PDF download? How do you actually get this onto some paper that you can use? One of the easiest ways to do this is to pull the image up on any sort of a screen that has a lot of brightness on it. Turn the brightness all the way up, place your paper over it. Then you're going to want to make things real spooky and turn all the lights off. Then once it's nice and dark, it's still daytime, so there is a window right here. So I can see it, but you probably can't see it. But you can definitely see where the screen is through this. Essentially, you can make your own light box either using an iPad or even a computer screen, and then you can just take a pencil and lightly follow those outlines to trace it onto the paper. Now, if your phone is your only screen that you have, that might not be as big as you want to paint it. You could use your phone, but that would definitely limit the size. What you can instead do is just print it out on just some printer paper, and then we'll have to transfer from this one onto something else. If you have carbon copy paper, you could just then layer them up so that you can press down and it will imprint the carbon where you trace and push down hard. But if you don't have that, you can use either a pencil or some charcoal, whatever color you want. We're gonna do a transfer drawing here, and I tend to like to use more of a sepia tone because it's lighter, so it doesn't show up quite as much in the final painting. In order to do this, all you're going to do is take your charcoal or your graphite or whatever you're going to use, something that's going to actually transfer over, and you're just going to scribble over the entire back of this design. Then you put the scribble part down onto whatever you're going to draw onto, then tape this down so that it doesn't move, and then you just trace directly over the drawing, pushing kind of hard. And anywhere you push down is going to actually transfer that onto the paper so that you can transfer it directly. The design is formatted for an 8x10, but if you like to work smaller, you can always print it smaller and then just transfer it over. All right, let's get to the painting. We're gonna go to the top-down version so you guys can see all of the setup and the supplies, and then we'll dive right in. Just like the kingfishers do. They really do dive. You should Google them. In order to do this tutorial, here are the supplies you're going to need. First off, your piece that you're going to paint on. I have mine on Stonehenge paper, and it has been printed with a laser jet, so this will not run, but you can transfer yours however you want to. I'm going to want to tape it down, so I have a piece of thick cardboard here. It's actually the back of an old Stonehenge sketchbook. So I'm going to tape that right onto there, which means I need some tape. This is just masking tape, the cheapest I could find. Some mixing wells, whatever mixing wells will be fine. These are the ones I like to use. They are little muffin tin mixing wells. You're gonna need 2 cups of water. You're gonna need something to wash your brush off on. I like to use a rag with a paper towel on top of it. Then you're gonna want some sort of a round brush. Today I'm gonna be using a size 12 round brush. And then in the book, we work from a limited color palette, and this is one of the exercises that has even more limited colors. We're just going to use 3. So today I'm going to use a Payne's Gray, a Burnt Sienna, and a Prussian Blue. We're going to get started by taping off our piece, and the reason we tape our piece is so that it stays in place. Both just so that it stays more flat, because this will kind of help distribute the pressure. It might still buckle a little bit, but this will help reduce that. But we also do this because it literally makes it stay in place. So we can move it around and it's not going to slide around on us. Now I did print this on an 8.5 by 11 sheet, so you can see it cuts off a little bit. I should have cut this down to an 8 by 10, but I think what I'll do is I'll actually just use my tape and then I can chop it later if I want to cut it down to size, because this was meant for an 8 by 10 size. So there we go. That should make it about 8 by 10. One additional supply you might want is a spray bottle, because we are going to be mixing up a little bit of some color. So I'm actually going to start by putting a couple sprays, once it wants to cooperate, into one of these wells, because we actually want to be able to fill a lot of area with one single color. So I want to make sure I fill this up enough to where it's definitely covering the bottom of this. Always err on the side of, oops, mixing a little too much color than not enough. You might also find it handy to have some tester strips, which are just little scrap pieces of paper. It could be the sides that you did actually cut off of this if you cut this actually down to the 8 by 10 size. And I'm going to make sure my brush is clean, because I don't always leave my brushes clean. So I'm just going to go ahead and give them a wash and then tap them off. Make sure there's no color coming off of that anywhere when I do tap my brush off. And then I'm going to kind of prepare by pre-squeezing out a little bit of each of these colors right on here. Not very much, kind of like a little smaller than a pea size amount. But I'm just going to squeeze a little bit of that. Of all three of these colors, again, I have a burnt sienna, a Prussian blue, and a Payne's gray. You don't have to have these exact colors, but something similar will work great. You just use whatever colors are your closest ones to these. A brown, a blue, and a gray, or a black color. We're going to start by actually mixing up kind of a bluish gray color. So again, I've got a clean brush, and then I'm going to grab a little bit of that Payne's gray in my brush, and I'm going to swirl it around into that water I added, making sure to really separate those bristles so that it really gets mixed in. And this is why I always have a tester strip. That looks super dark, but look how light that actually is. I want it to be a little bit darker for kind of the base color. There we go. But I want it to be a little more blue because they have a little bit of a blue undertone. So I'm going to grab some of that Prussian blue and I'm going to mix it in. There we go. That's my base color that I want. Something similar to that will work great. Okay, so I'm going to have all of this right here. I'm also going to have my space to actually tap my brush off and clean it. And then I have my painting over here. I'm going to be working on this painting in kind of sections. So the first sections that I want to work on are the kingfisher, the top of the head. This area here is kind of this blue-gray, and then also this kind of banded area. They are belted kingfishers because they have this white band right around their neck, and they also have a white chest. So we're going to be avoiding those areas. We're going to be avoiding the beak and the eyes. But I'm going to start by filling my brush up with that color that I just mixed up, and I'm just going to kind of push it up and down right along the edges. I don't need to get into these exactly. We're going to go over these a couple different times. They're just kind of a guideline to show you how much fluff there really is. I'm going to try to keep these a little wet around the edges because I do want to come back in and we're going to drop in some different colors. Just like that. First, I'm going to put a little water in my brush and let's wash that in. I want there to be variation in this. A little more water. Let's wash that all the way around the eye. Just like that. Now what I want to do to get some kind of fun colors going in, I'm going to dry my brush off so it's just barely damp, and then I'm going to go straight into that little puddle I put there, and I want to touch right along the edges to give some darker areas. while it's still wet. So this is already wet, and it's going to stay damp for a little bit if you added enough water. I'm trying to get a little variation going so that we have a little bit of texture. I'm also going to tap on those little markings I made just to give them a little sense of direction and a little more flavor. And then let's wash our brush and let's do the same thing in fewer areas, but in a couple areas using that bright blue. So just getting a tiny bit in the tip of my brush, and then let's just drop that in a couple areas just so we have some fun color variation here. We don't need a bunch of it. Just a little bit. Wash my brush, wipe it off so that I just have a little water in it. And then I'm going to start actually dropping in some water because I want to create some blooms. I'm trying to create texture within this. All right, so at this point, if I bring this up to the light, see how we can still see in some areas a little bit of a reflection? At this point, if you feel like it, you can continue to mess while it's still a little wet, concentrating some of this darker color along the edges to let it kind of flow in. And I'm also going to place this darker Payne's gray right around the eye to give it a little more kind of, not sunken in, but they often have darker areas around eyes on birds and other animals. So I'm just going to add that in. I will be adding in some more details on this a little bit later, but this is about where I want to get the head for the first layer on my Kingfisher. So I've got a lot of the color really concentrated kind of around the edges and on some of those scribbles. You can really have fun with this. You don't have to add in the blue if you don't like it. I just think it adds a little extra something kind of fun. Now, also, if you're super confused, don't worry. This could be a good one to do in conjunction with the book itself, because the book goes over all sorts of things like how wet you should actually have it with examples, and we actually talk about satin and flood and gloss, and it makes a lot of sense when you actually play with them all together, which will give you different amounts of those bleeding effects. So this part is actually kind of covered in the book. This is one of the techniques that we talk about, is how wet do we actually make our pieces. We're going to do a very similar thing for this belt and then on the back with those colors, but I want to throw in one other thing. We're also going to play a little bit with some lifting. You can lift with a brush, but you can also lift with something like a paper towel. And you know what I can actually do, because I want to add in some of the texture with some of the feathers, is I can actually fold this paper towel up to get kind of a little bit of a rounded feather shape that will allow me to help lift out a little bit of that color to get some subtle variation so that we can actually lift out some of those feather textures. I'm going to start with a clean brush, tap it dry, and then again I'm going to grab this same color, the first one we used, on the top, and I'm going to place this kind of around the edges just like I did before. I'm trying to use kind of a puddling technique, and I'm actually going to work in another section. I'm going to do that part a little bit later so that this area doesn't dry. If you're struggling with keeping things wet, sometimes you just got to work in a smaller area. I'm going to wash my brush so I've got some water in it, and then let's soften all this together. I'm going to try to keep this edge wet though so that we don't get a harsh line, but then I'm going to take that piece that I kind of rolled up, and I'm going to lift out along the markings where I made some of those little feathers. You could add in a few more if you wanted as well, but that will help us get a little texture. Now we can go in with our darker color, drop it along the edges, I'm just putting this Payne's gray right in the tip of my brush and along some of these edges. I'm also going to sneak it in between where I lifted a little bit to maybe give some of these a little bit of kind of some contrast between where they're light and where they're dark. Okay, before we get too far, I'm going to again wash my brush and then grab this color. And before that side dries, I'm going to pull that down. Okay, everywhere that it's still wet, hold it up to a light so that you can actually see where it's still wet. That's where we can still play and have a bit of fun. I'm going to grab some of that bright blue just in the tip of my brush, and I'm going to just drop that in a couple areas. I just want there to be these little like spots of blue. And that's just because I think it's going to be fun. If you don't think it's going to be fun, that's totally fine. Again, I'm going to go into that black color, and I'm going to drop that along some of the edges. This is kind of a shading technique too, because I am mainly putting this kind of along the edges. That's going to help the outer part be a bit darker, kind of sending it backwards just a bit. And then I'm going to wash my brush. And again, I'm trying to take advantage of those back runs, or blooms actually, which is where you just drop water in on top of the color you added, and it adds in kind of a fun, interesting texture. If you wanted to, you could come in and do some more lifting on certain parts of this. Ooh, that can be kind of fun. It kind of adds in kind of like the hint to maybe where some of those feathers might be. I'm not going to do any more on that part because I don't want to mess with it too much. At this point, because I'm working in sections, the next things I want to do are touching areas that are wet or slightly wet. So because I don't want them to run into each other, I am going to let it dry, or, well, you know what I'm going to do. I'm going to make it dry. The next parts of this that I want to focus on are actually going to be the pupil of the eye and then the bottom part of the beak. I want both of those to be nearly black or as dark as I possibly can make them. And getting really dark colors in watercolor is difficult. So one of the ways to do it, so like this looks like it's super dark. It's not. You could keep adding, keep adding, keep adding, keep adding. Well, the other thing is if we don't need too much of it, and for those two little areas we don't need a ton, I can just take my brush, which is effectively just a little damp, and I can really load my brush up. Now we want to make sure that we can still actually move our brush around. See how it still kind of flows? If I try to just grab this and it's dry, it's going to get kind of sticky, and it's still not dry. See how it's going to get kind of sticky and it's not going to go how we want it to? So we do want to make sure that our brush is a little bit wet so that it's going to glide, and we're going to mainly have it full with paint, but there's enough water in my brush to allow it to actually glide over the paper. So I'm going to load it basically as much as I can, but it's going to have some water in there, mainly loaded with the paint though. All right, so where I'm going to place this now is right at the bottom of this. And if you find, I sometimes find it's easier, especially with straight lines, to turn the page so that it's in a direction that just works better for me. And I'm going to fill that area in. I'm also going to fill the little nose hole right there in. And then I'm going to fill in the pupil, avoiding those two little doots that I put there to serve as the highlight. Trying to make this as dark as I can, and if I need to, I'm going to refill my brush. Oop. Well, I got rid of one of mine. It's okay. Sometimes it happens. I still have a bit of a highlight though. Would be cuter with the second one, but I only have the one. Okay, so I've got the bottom of the beak done and the pupil. And again, I need those to dry because now I want to be able to do this part and this part. But before I do that, I could actually come in, if I kind of like how my gray parts are, but if you're like, I just want there to be a little more texture, we could come in and I'm going to take a little bit of this color here, and then I'm going to grab some of that black, or the Payne's gray. It's a gray color, but it effectively is black. I'm just going to darken it just a little bit. I'm also going to fill, my brush is filled with it, but I'm going to tap it so that there's not too much in there because I just want to be able to lightly touch and just kind of layer on this slightly darker color to add a little more texture. To a couple of these areas, because that fluff on their heads is pretty messy. It's kind of like they have built-in bed head. We could also do the same thing right around the eye if we wanted to kind of darken that. You don't have to do this part if you don't want to, or you can. I'm just adding in a couple little touches here and there. We could also come in here and add some more scruff to the outside. There. I'm not going to do much more, but sometimes that can add quite a bit, even just a few little strokes. But again, the other areas I want to do, this needs to be dry, so we're going to let it dry or make it dry. Once it's dry, I want to add in a little bit of texture and a little bit of depth or roundness to the white parts on the body that we have not yet touched. So what I'm actually going to do is just put a little more water in this one that we made a little bit more towards the gray side. I don't want this to be very dark. Even that might be just a touch too dark, so I'm going to put a little more water in there. Okay, that's a little better. What I'm going to do is I'm going to touch this right to the sides. Okay, and under the chin, because that would definitely be a little bit in shadow. Okay, then I'm also going to bring it over onto this side because there would be some roundness kind of in here. Wash my brush. And then I'm going to tap it so that it's not really full of water, and I'm going to allow my brush to kind of messily bring this in and even run out of a little bit of that water. Just kind of scribbling this back and forth. If you want to, or you're feeling a bit brave, you could put a little bit of that in here. And just, we're dry brushing, which is where we let the water in our brush kind of run out, and it can create some interesting textures, and a couple little strokes like that might even help you kind of allude to some of those feathers in there. Like, we didn't really have to paint them, but by adding just some of those little quick dry brush strokes, it's kind of like, hey, maybe there's a feather there. Now for the beak, I want the top part to be nice and light, maybe even just letting it be water. And then I want it to get darker and darker as it kind of meets towards this middle line. Again, I'm going to move my page here in a way that's easier for my brush to move. So I'm going to start by, let's just add some water right along the top of the beak. You can see I've placed water just at the top. Then let's fill it with this slightly darker color. Let's go into that kind of middle color we added in. Ooh. And now let's start tapping directly in to that Payne's gray color. And mine is bleeding kind of together, so what I'm going to need to do is take my brush, I'm going to tap it so that it's dry, and then I'm going to suck up that extra water along the top part so that it's kind of dry. And then again, I can take a little scrap of paper towel. Let's actually lift out along the top. I just want to give it a little depth. And if I want to, I can come in with some of that Payne's gray to kind of shadow, maybe where it kind of connects to the face just a bit. Okay. Oh, I think he's so cute so far. We have our final touches are going to be adding a super dark brown and then also just adding in a bit of this branch. You don't have to add in this branch if you didn't want to. You could actually edit that part out in your, if you were kind of doing a transfer drawing, because look how cute he is. I think he's adorable. But I am going to add in a dark brown. So I'm going to, I don't need to mix this up. I barely have to put this inside the eye. So I'm just going to take a damp brush. I'm going to take some of this burnt sienna and then some of that Payne's gray, and I'm just going to mix them together until it's a nice dark brown color. Any sort of a dark brown will do. And now I'm just going to place this right in the eye. Just like that. And then we can actually use this as kind of the base color for our branch. I'm going to place it in the middle here, put some water in my brush, and then let's just kind of spread this out. I'm not worrying too much about the coverage because branches are really natural. So I want to be able to come in and I'm going to put a whole bunch of different kind of color details in here, or let some more of that color flow in. As a matter of fact, let's take some directly from that burnt sienna and let's put that just in a couple little places. Just scribble it around while it's still a little wet. Have fun with this part. And then I'm going to go straight into that Payne's gray, and on the bottom I'm just going to drop that along to kind of put it into a bit of shadow, but also maybe hint to the fact that there is some more color variation. If you wanted to get a little fancy, since we've been playing with lifting, we can take the rough edge of a paper towel and we could kind of lift towards the other side. You want to be a little careful not to go all the way so it doesn't transfer all the way to the other side of the page. But that'll give it a little texture. I hope you had as much fun painting that as I did. These little birds are just so fun, and this is kind of indicative of what's in the book. There's all these outlines, so it kind of feels like a coloring book, and in some ways it is. But what I'm really trying to do is allow you to focus on different techniques. So in this one, we play around with some kind of wet on wet and letting things charge in. We're also working on a bit of layering, and then we're doing a bit of lifting. My goal in the book is that all of the lessons have at least one takeaway for technique, because while sometimes it's fun to just practice a technique, most of the time you actually want to do something to practice the technique. And this way, you don't also have to figure out how to draw something in order to make the painting. And because there are PDF downloads, that also means that you can repaint this using the same techniques or slightly different techniques or slightly different colors a bunch of different times, and There's so many different things you can learn by having kind of the initial stage where you don't have to think about what to paint, and you also don't have to learn a completely different skill, that is sketching, in order to do it. This book has all sorts of projects. They range from very simple patterns to more complex things that are a little bit harder to do. And my goal was to make sure that we had a wide variety, both for people who are of different skill sets. If you are brand new to watercolor, some of these might be intimidating at first. So some of the first ones are going to be those ones that are going to be confidence boosters. It's just going to let you get paint onto paper. And then you're going to be able to kind of build yourself up until you're ready to tackle something more complicated. On the other hand, maybe you're more experienced with watercolor, so you're going to want to dive into some of the more complicated ones, but there are going to be those days where your brain, it just wants to kind of relax. And so that's where you can go back to the more simple ones. We have everything in here from some patterns, landscapes, flowers, fruit. There are other birds in this book, but they are more simple. So this one is a little bit more complicated of a concept with some more complicated techniques in it. The other one is a little bit easier. So you can kind of get both into the spectrum if you use this video, and then also in the book you get a slightly different type of bird painting. The book's official release date is October 29th, and you can buy it from any of your favorite booksellers, and it comes with a whole bunch of instruction plus techniques, and then it has a practice pad of paper with everything pre-printed out, so you can just open it up and start painting. And then if you want to do it even more, I insisted we include QR codes so that you could do things like download all the different PDFs. Another really cool thing about the book is it doesn't just stop at the book itself, because there are some QR codes in here, and they do lead to some different videos. I think there are 2 full-length tutorials that accompany the written instructions in case you just need a little more help, that kind of help demonstrate things in real time or visually, because sometimes you need to be able to see the motion with watercolor for some of the techniques. So it really is meant to kind of be this and a little bit more, so that we can learn with something physical, because that's one of my favorite ways to learn, but also video is so helpful in being able to see how different things kind of flow together or how wet things are. Pictures don't always capture that, so I wanted to make sure that that's in there. Anyways, thank you guys so much. I'm so excited for this to actually be on the shelves, and it would be so cool to walk in somewhere and see this sold. So hopefully some bookstores actually buy it. Anyways, thanks for spending some time today. Also, let me know in the comments, what should we name our Kingfisher?